Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. It's good to be back. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming David Nemer. David is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, a faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center and Princeton University's Brazil Lab, and a research fellow at the Washington, Brazil office. David is from Vitória, Espírito Santo, but did his doctoral work in the United States, and his current project explores the problem of online misinformation focused on countries in the Global South. First of all, David, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered. I'm glad that you could join us today.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm curious to know, first of all, how you ended up at the University of Virginia. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your professional trajectory?
That's a very good question. And I think this is where our paths overlapped way before here, because I was an exchange student back in 2001 in the good old town of Richmond, Indiana. I couldn't pick my city. It was the city that they chose for me. You know, one of those all-American cities, stayed with the host family, and stayed for 1 year, graduated from Richmond High School, and we got super close and went back to Brazil to do my college. Couldn't stay in the US because it was too expensive, and in Brazil could join the federal universities, which is basically supported by the government. And after finishing college, I decided to do my master's in Germany because, again, the master's in Germany was also free and didn't have to pay a lot of money to do the master's back in the US, which was something that I wanted to do. But after the master's, I decided to do a PhD, and Indiana was my first choice because of the family, to stay close to the host family. So I applied to Indiana University, and I had a slight change of fields. I was coming through computer science, and then I decided to go into the field of anthropology of technology or science and technology studies. NIU had a wonderful program. Did my PhD there, decided to focus on Brazil. So I did my work in the favelas of my hometown, Victoria. I saw this as a good way to somehow give back to my city, and especially given most studies in Brazil were highly focused on either São Paulo, Rio. That's why people think I'm from Rio or São Paulo, or the Amazon even. And decided to bring that awareness to other parts of the country. Did my work there, and then graduated. And here in the US, which is different than in Brazil, there's no such a thing as concurso, which is an exam that you pass to become a professor. And once you pass this exam and the selection process, then you have that sort of stability, kind of like the tenure process. Here in the US, you go through a selection process that it's really close to what happens in the private sector, right? You send in your CV, you have interviews, campus visit, and then you get chosen or not. It's a brutal system, which I feel very fortunate that I got my first tenure track right off the bat, after graduation at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, which was really cool because it was really close to IU. So I could drive back home and visit friends, visit my host family. But then it wasn't a very good fit. In fact, UVA, University of Virginia, has always been the place that I wanted to go because of their media studies department. And as soon as they had an opening in that department, I applied. It was after 3 years in Kentucky, and voila, I'm there.
There you are. So why don't you tell us about your current research project? I know you're at Harvard for the year as a visiting scholar. Why don't you tell us about what you're working on?
Yes, so here at Harvard, I'm gonna work with a team to develop a methodology and integrate a couple of tools to monitor the disinformation campaigns that will take place in Brazil, especially this year because it's election year. In 2018, we all experienced one of the worst fake news or disinformation delusions in history, I wanna say. And knowing that misinformation was there to support the sole candidate Bolsonaro, then we know that this practice will come again. And because the tools that he used before are already well known, then we just don't know what are the new ways of engaging with misinformation to kind of like promote him as to re-election. The reason why I'm so certain that he's going to have to engage in disinformation is that he's delivering the country in the worst crisis of the country without any precedent. So for him to convince people to vote for him, he will have to fabricate a reality that is so far from the so-called real reality. So he will have to rely on misinformation to convince people to vote for him.
So how did it work in 18? How did he actually manage to generate so much popular support on social media and be effective in using that as a means to be elected?
Right. So he was very smart to capitalize on the whole anti-Workers' Party sentiment that was already happening. And he had very few. So in Brazil, there's the electoral time or electoral showings on TV that is mandatory. And based on your coalitions, you have specific chunks of times on TV. And because he was the new person, he didn't have a big alliance, so he had a small chunk of that TV show. So he had to rely on other means to get his word across. He was already working with other businessmen to get social media pages and accounts to promote his ideas. He was constantly on TV shows making the most outrageous comments to kind of bring that attention to him. He started on Facebook. Very few people know this. He started on Facebook, but it was right when Facebook decided to do some public relations outreaching and decided to cancel and ban a couple of pages that were promoting misinformation. So seeing that, he redirected his strategies into WhatsApp. And as we know, WhatsApp engages in encrypted messaging where it's impossible for WhatsApp as a platform to identify or even read the content of each messages. So
there are a lot of, let me stop you for a second. There are a lot of our listeners who might not know what WhatsApp is because it's not common to use it in the United States. So why don't you just briefly explain that vehicle for communication and why it's so popular in Brazil?
Yes. So WhatsApp is a messaging app, which is very popular in Brazil, just because SMS text or the average text that we do on phones here in the US has never been free in Brazil. And it was always expensive, actually, to the point that it would cost 25 cents of the real each text. So that was a lot of money. So text was never really part of the communication ecosystem in the country just because it was expensive. Once Wi-Fi and the internet becomes more available, then Brazilians found WhatsApp, this perfect tool that they could text as much as they wanted for free because it went all through Wi-Fi or the internet, so they didn't have to pay per text. And this is not only in Brazil. So in Europe, for example, Germany, I did my master's there, texting was always expensive as well. So they did the same movement once Wi-Fi and wireless internet became available. They all went to WhatsApp as well. So the only reason why, one of the main reasons why WhatsApp isn't very popular in the US, because Americans were already used to using text as their main tools of texting to each other, not another app.
And it's common. And what percentage of people in Brazil use WhatsApp, would you say?
So 96% of the people who have a smartphone use WhatsApp as their main means of communication. That's about 120 million people in a country where total of inhabitants, it's about 210 million. So over like 60% of the people.
So Bolsonaro switches to WhatsApp and starts using it effectively. It's encrypted, but how does he use it to his advantage to be effective in the electoral campaign?
Yeah, so this is where my research came into play in 2018. We all knew that Facebook's algorithm helped boost Trump's campaign, just because the way that the algorithm works and prioritizes hateful content because that generates more engagement. But on WhatsApp, there's no algorithm behind that platform. So for you to receive a message, you need deliberate human action. In other words, somebody to send you a text for you to receive it, right? So there's no algorithm, there's no automation. So in the absence of this algorithm to curate and deliver misinformation, Bolsonaro, not Bolsonaro per se, but the campaign that was working to promote him, built the so-called human infrastructure that I call human infrastructure of misinformation, which mimicked the algorithm on Facebook that not only curated and delivered misinformation to all kinds of groups and people, but also created misinformation. And they worked quite fast to understand the current climate or the current issue of the moment to create the misinformation and spread as far and wide as they could. And this misinformation, this human infrastructure and misinformation worked like a pyramid, where at the very top, you had the people who created misinformation or the fake news. And they belonged to several groups that were directed towards promoting Bolsonaro, bringing news about Bolsonaro, creating this sort of cave where people wouldn't reach outside for other sources of knowledge, but they would rely on the misinformation that was shared in there. So at the very top, you have the influencers. In the middle, which is the second level, which is basically the glue of this infrastructure, is what I call the Bolso army. They were the ones that worked actively to distribute the misinformation that were first shared in those groups to other groups. So they were the ones who were bringing misinformation from WhatsApp to Twitter, to groups on Facebook, to groups on WhatsApp that they were infiltrated, like the church groups, the family groups, the larger soccer fan groups. So they work in very specific ways to get those misinformation across. And the base of this pyramid is what I call the average Brazilians, which were the vast majority in those groups that were there to basically consume misinformation. So just by looking at this infrastructure of misinformation, you have a perfect ecosystem, because you have who creates, who shares, and who consumes misinformation. And this behavior could see across many other groups, although my sample and my approach to this research was qualitatively through observations and interviews, but this was a behavior that was mimicked in several other groups. So I focused first at 4 groups, and then that grew to 73, and I could always see the same behavior repeating over and over again.
So let me just ask 2 questions to clarify things. So first of all, at the time, was there unlimited access to a group? In other words, an unlimited number of people could be in a given WhatsApp group, or was it limited to a certain number of people?
That was limited to a certain number of people. And for example, each group that I was back then had about 160 people on average. On Telegram, however, that's where things get more unlimited, in a way that groups there get about 200,000 people.
Wow.
And Telegram channels get unlimited people. And Telegram is a similar app.
And Bolsonaro seems to be moving towards Telegram as a more effective way to get out his message this time. But why didn't Twitter? Why didn't he use Twitter like Trump did with millions of followers? What was the reason he chose WhatsApp over Twitter?
Because WhatsApp, he has control of the content shared there. There's no such a thing as content moderation on WhatsApp, because there's no way for WhatsApp to read the content being shared there. And because he had a bad experience on Facebook, that Facebook took down a couple of MBL pages and other reactionary figures in Brazil that were promoting misinformation. His campaign saw that as a red flag, seeing that was not a platform to invest their time to promote a campaign, to get him promoted.
So Bolsonaro was effective in getting out the word of his campaign, but that doesn't necessarily mean a person is going to get elected. What was the content of the message he got out, and why was that an influential part of his election success in 18?
Because so outside those groups, Bolsonaro worked tirelessly to delegitimize the press. So his fans no longer believe in any of the news venues in Brazil, and they turned to those WhatsApp groups as their only source and trusty news that they could consume. So it didn't matter what Globo said. It didn't matter what the big newspaper said. They will only believe in what those WhatsApp groups will tell them. And this was a great strategy to keep their base fired up and always united to fight for him. Because he always played a victim game that, the press was there to catch him. Cultural Marxism was there to catch him. The Workers' Party was there to catch him. And by creating this doubt towards the mainstream media, he was able to later on, when he got elected, to create this faithfulness among the base, because they no longer trust the media. And Bolsonaro has never left this campaign mode. So he keeps finding enemies to get the base fired up. So he's constantly criticizing the media. So no longer these people will get out of these bubbles to look for other things. So it's a way to feed them into state propaganda, for example, which we've seen how it played out dramatically in this pandemic, right?
Well, why don't you talk a little bit about that? How has that played out in the pandemic in terms of, I was going to actually first, maybe we can ask this first question first. Could you give some examples of some of the fake news that he circulated that kind of consolidated his campaign and hurt the campaign of his major contender, Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party?
Yeah, so with Fernando Haddad, one of the most popular misinformation that circulated in those groups were that Fernando Haddad, once elected, he would pass a executive order that would allow adults to have sex with 12-year-old children. And this is, sounds outrageous, but this follows the rationale and the narrative that always comes with far-right governments. This is the whole idea of pedophilia, right? Because they know that the traditional family want to protect their kids from being influenced by the so-called gender ideologies from pedophiles, and he wants to be this person, this hero that will protect the kids from the pedophiles or from the enemies. And of course, the pedophiles, the reason why the far right loves to bring them up is because it's an idea that down the road they want to attack LGBT rights, because they believe that pedophiles were kids that once got molested or abused by homosexuals, and then once they grow up to become pedophiles, and they continue the circle. So this is the outrageous idea of the far right and pedophiles, because in the end, it's about taking down rights from LGBT folks. Same thing with the gender ideology or the so-called gay kit. He said, this was another big misinformation. He said that schools were distributing the so-called gay kit that would promote gender ideology. In other words, that would basically teach kids to be gay, lesbians, or to completely demolish the idea of the traditional family. And by doing this, eventually these kids will become gays. Hence, we have to fight those kids because in their ideas, this is something wrong. Like, we should not allow our kids to be gay. So that's why we have to save their children, which is, unfortunately became a slogan of the QAnon far-right groups here in the US.
Right. So there's a lot of similarities there. In fact, before we talk about what happened afterward during his presidency, what would you say are some of the comparisons you might make between Trump's dangers towards democracy and his threat to democracy and that of Bolsonaro through the electoral campaign and beyond?
Right. So there are many parallels, and so much so that there's this suspicion that Bolsonaro tried to follow Steve Bannon's playbook, right? Because, for example, Trump, of course, used the whole anti-immigration narrative here in the US to get his base voting for him. So he created this fear against immigrants. Bolsonaro tried to do the same, but it didn't really stick. He tried to use the Venezuelans that were fleeing to Brazil to try to find shelter and try to find work or food. And he tried to blame the Venezuelans for some sort of crisis that Brazil was facing, but it didn't stick. However, the whole war against communism, like this idea that communism has always been around and it's here to get Brazil and destroy the Brazilian society. Also, this idea of the Christian traditional family, right? That communism or the left are here to destroy the pillars of Brazilian society. What he tried to do is to pass this idea of a Brazilian identity that is Christian, white, heterosexual. But Brazil is a young country. Of course, we were discovered in the 1500s, but we didn't get to develop ourselves as a nation until the 1700s, 1800s. So to understand Brazil as there is such a thing as a Brazilian identity. Even myself, I'm not Brazilian. I don't even know how to describe a Brazilian identity. So he tries to do that based on his own ideals that follow Trump's own ideals of what an American identity is. And to think that a Brazilian would be white, and whiteness is so complicated in Brazil. It's not how we see whiteness here in America. It just shows that he has no idea what a true Brazilian identity really is. So he tried to build on that, nationalism. He has no regards to the environment, right? He's been deforesting the Amazon. It's been in a speed that we've never seen before. We have mining going on in the Amazon. The same thing we saw with Trump. We saw the mining industry coming back up, lobbying towards policy to take down some environment policies that passed during the Obama era. So basically following both Trump's footsteps. But now that Trump is out of the picture, it's been interesting that he's been less of a Trump-like person in Brazil. And he's a little lost because he's way behind in the polls for the upcoming elections, which is showing that he still doesn't know how to handle that. He's always known how to handle, he's always been very good in leading the polls and knowing that he's going to win. He's never done really well when he's behind. And he's actually somebody that has always won. He's been in Congress for 30 years, never did anything. So he tried to sell this idea of the anti-establishment like Trump did, but he was the establishment himself. I mean, he played the system like no one else. He was just there for 30 years, never did anything. Employed all of his kids through the state, got the other all of his kids elected because of his last name. So his idea of the anti-establishment is very hypocritical, but it sticks to people just because he says things the way that Trump does, unapologetic, racist stuff, sexist stuff. And people think it's great because, he says things as it is. But we're seeing that just seeing those things don't take us very further.
So you mentioned earlier about COVID and what he did in COVID and the ineffectiveness of his campaign on COVID. How does that relate to this question of the social media and fake news?
Right. So, for example, since the beginning, he was a denialist. So he was anti-social distancing. He was parading on the streets without a mask. He got several tickets for going to bakeries and bringing crowds with them. So he was constantly fighting the restrictive measures that his own health minister was trying to put forth. So in these groups, because he has already created this break of trust with the media. So in those groups, we're sharing things that would corroborate with what he was saying. For example, that people were dying and doctors were putting on the death certificate on purpose that was COVID just to inflate the numbers. So because of this misinformation, people were opening coffins to make sure that the people had actually died of COVID, or to see that the bodies were actually there, because they thought they were burying coffins. And there's this very dramatic picture from Manaus, this open land with a bunch of coffins. And they were saying that those are just images to impact people, to shock people, that in fact, those coffins were empty. And guess what? There was one case that one family went there, opened the coffin, and got COVID.
Horrible.
So this is like the how extreme it got. And not to mention how like the vaccines are inefficient and how masks are inefficient, how COVID actually doesnn't exist. It's actually just a little flu, as Bolsonaro loves to say. So even nowadays, as we passed 700,000 deaths due to COVID, we still have people that don't believe that COVID is a thing.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about your book, your recently published book, Technology of the Oppressed, with MIT Press. Given the title, it's clear that it's been influenced by Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, and his masterpiece, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Could you tell me a little bit about Freire and how it influenced your own work?
Yes. So, wow, it's quite of a task to summarize Paulo Freire, but I'll try here my best, just because he's this huge person. So, Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educationalist and philosopher whose radical ideas about pedagogy, learning, and knowledge established the critical pedagogy movement in Brazil and in the world, right? So basically, Freire argues that education should allow the oppressed to regain their sense of humanity and consequently overcome their condition. So he says that the oppressed must play a role in their own liberation. So it shouldn't come just from outside. So he highlights, for example, the importance of conscientização, or becoming aware in the process, of learning to perceive like social, economic, and political contradictions, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. So basically, he wants the oppressed to catalyze transformative actions during their pursuit of freedom. So this is a little bit of what I bring in my book, is to how the oppressed appropriate technologies in their pursuit of freedom. And in the book, it's not so much about a full liberation, because Paulo Freire says that we're never full liberated, but how they find instances of liberations as they appropriate a technology that actually was developed under the oppressor premise. Because we have, for example, Facebook, WhatsApp promoting misinformation that promotes the rise of far-right governments, which are never good with the oppressed. So how would these people appropriate the same technology to find some sort of liberation? And your question about being influenced by Freire, it's actually a very good question, because I only came across Paulo Freire, as in like I read Paulo Freire, was during my PhD. So in Brazil, unfortunately, I was never given the chance, or it was never brought into the classroom readings by Paulo Freire, which is interesting because the right in Brazil keeps complaining that we have too much Paulo Freire. This is why our education system is, it's a failure, which is actually not true. I was only able to find out about Paulo Freire abroad. And he's, one of the most cited the social sciences. So it's not surprising.
So tell us a little bit about the ways in which people have used social media and the internet to liberate themselves, or to be more anti-oppressed.
Yes. So one of the examples that I love to talk about is the selfies, right? Which is a very mundane strategy of engaging with technologies. We all post selfies. We go out, we post selfies. We eat a sophisticated meal, we post the selfies. Of course, they engage in the same ways in the favelas. But something that caught my attention is how they used selfies as one of their main channels to communicate with each other, and also to express their emotions and feelings, just because they felt really repressed. They were very cautious and careful about the things that they posted online, because one, they fear about being mocked by upper class people based on their Portuguese, based on the things that they talked about, their slangs. So they were never really comfortable in sharing those things. And also, unfortunately, the drug cartel in Brazil is a problem, as well as police brutality, which means that those territories are constantly in armed conflict. And because of that, then the cartels would frequently watch the people from the communities online to make sure that they were not giving away any sort of information or anything that would not be welcome in their eyes or compromise their business. Because of this fear of retaliation and being mocked, then they use selfies as a way to communicate with each other, the regular favela residents. And one of the ways that I found this out was during a shootout that was happening in the favelas. Everybody rushed inside of a land house, and some things got calm again. And I saw one girl, which I'll call here Anna. She posted a selfie crying, and I knew what it was. Her friends knew what it was about. But then I saw somebody outside the Lynn house looking at the phone, looking at, which looked like her photo. And he was trying to match if that photo was her, because he saw the photo of her crying. So he called her out, and I watched the whole scene. It was a little tense. She came back like rolling her eyes, and she said to me, you know what happened? Did you see what just happened? I was like, no, what happened? She said, he's from the cartel. He wanted to make sure that if I was crying because of the situation here, because if I'm not happy here, I could leave. I shouldn't stay here. But then I told him that I just had a fight with my boyfriend, and he let me go. So it's a way to communicate a lot to the target audience, but also communicating a little to the audience that shouldn't belong to that sort of communication. So for those outside who didn't know her, she was crying because of the boyfriend, but her friends knew that she was crying because she didn't like the current living conditions there. The same thing that Pedro, for example, 13 years old, couldn't read or write, but he could post selfies online. And because it was difficult for mothers in the favelas who had to work all day, it was difficult for them to leave kids unattended on the streets because of many things that could happen, the armed conflict, to be recruited by the cartel. They didn't like that. So they left their kids in the land houses or the telecenters that worked kind of like a digital daycare for them. So Pedro's mom said, every 2 hours you get online, you post a selfie because I'll see that you're okay.
Wow.
Everything's fine. So one of the days I checked his timeline, and it was a bunch of his like, hi, and her mom would like each comment to acknowledge him that she saw it and he's okay and he can continue playing with her friends. So it's like it's way more meaningful than just one click, one like that maybe we see and that we don't understand. We think, okay, you got 2 likes, but that like means so many things to a different context. And this is what I try to bring in the book, like this completely different understanding, the social cultural context of using these technologies in a critical context.
So you mentioned the land house or the local area network house. I'm not aware that we really have them in the United States in a common way. What are they? How do they function in Brazil?
Yeah, I love the concept of land houses. So land houses are like cyber cafes, but not so much about the well-behaved cyber cafes that we see here in the North. It's actually a very nice, organized, chaotic scene that you see people playing PlayStations. It becomes the internet hub of the favelas because internet access there is hard, not just because it's expensive, but also because the infrastructure doesn't bring internet to them. So they use these centers to play computers, games. They host birthday parties. They find shelter when there's a shootout outside, because even the cartels understand that land houses and telecenters are sacred places that are neutral zones. Like no one goes in there to create any trouble, because those places were owned by favela residents, from the favela residents to favela residents. So it was promoting the service the same way that they would perceive the church in the local market. So the land houses were places where people would find shelter as well.
And these are individuals offering these places, or these are community organizations or NGOs who are offering these land houses?
So the land houses were private businesses owned by local residents that usually they will have like a back room or extend their homes to build like a little computer setting. But the telecenters were sponsored by the city, which was like free. So telecenters, they would still have to pay like R$2, which would be now, 50 cents for an hour, give and take. Telecenters were free. But in land houses, it was close to their homes because it was right in the back alleys of the favelas. So it was more reachable to them. And they could also play their favorite games because land houses had PlayStations and Xbox and Windows, whereas telecenters only had Linux, where they couldn't play their favorite games. So they were not competitive centers. They were actually complementary in many different ways. So in one of the land houses that I researched, actually, because the internet provider wouldn't bring internet to the favela, he actually had to not rent, but like subscribe to an internet plan at the base of the hill, right where the frontier, the border of the favela in the city, because he had an uncle that lived there. he subscribed to the internet there, brought up about 500 meters of Ethernet cable all the way up to the favela. And from there, he was able to redistribute the internet connection. He would like charge like $10, which was still attainable to most people, but it was all taken. He had like 15 Linksys routers spread throughout the favelas. And he was like the most loved and hated person because the hillsides, the rain and the wind would constantly break the infrastructure. So people like knock on his door and beg him to fix, but of course he couldn't go in the middle of the rain. So people get a little mad, but then he would get over it as soon as the internet was back. But yeah, so all these acts of engaging with technology, it's nothing like how we engage, right? We flip the switch here and we expect the light to come on. There, it takes much more human effort and community effort to make the infrastructure work for them. So this is why they are set behind so many steps that by the time they are in a place where they can compete with those in the upper classes, they're already tired, they're already exhausted, they're not given the support to keep going. So they can only go so far, where those who have the privilege can keep walking without having to worry about the things that they have to worry about.
So you had said, David, that Lula is ahead in the polls and Bolsonaro is trailing, and it's kind of disconcerting for him because he's never been in that position. I remember I was in Brazil during the 2018 presidential elections, and a campaign worker, campaign organizer, person who was in charge of one of the important senatorial campaigns, I had a drink with him the night before the election, and he was discussing this really bizarre way in which the right had monitored and dominated the use of social media. And this was a person, candidate, was a Workers' Party candidate. And they were making the comment at the time of like, Workers' Party didn't fully understand how this was working because they were used to traditional campaigns where you organize rallies and you mobilize people to come and see the candidate. This was a very different way of working. Has the Workers' Party figured out what's going on in terms of social media, and will they prepare to confront the right in the elections? And I'm mentioning the Workers' Party because Lula is so far ahead.
Right.
Is there a way that they will be able to counter the effectiveness of Bolsonaro in this election?
So, okay, this is a very hard question because there are two things here. So yes, the Workers' Party got that sort of criticism for not being upfront with the new technologies and being able to engage with their base. The thing is, on one side, we have one party that sticks to the rules, sticks to the laws, and the other party plays without rules or laws. So there's no competition. So there's no way that Workers' Party could play on the level playing field the same way as Bolsonaro because he doesn't follow any rules. Whereas it's expected that the Workers' Party will follow the rules. So one, they will never be able to compete because of these different expectations, and which is very unfair. However, that shouldn't work as a way to unmotivate these people. They actually have to work twice as hard to figure out a way to beat the other side, following the rules. And that's when you have to become really innovative. So far, Jim, I haven't seen anything that actually, makes my eyes shine to say that this is the way. I've heard that people are still trying to contact bloggers, and I'm sorry, bloggers are so 2005. It doesn't work now. But one thing is that they are aware of the problem, and I think that, and I want to hope that they are working towards a way to efficiently talk to the base, getting the base motivated to go out and vote. If Workers' Party gets the people out to vote, the same way that happened here, that what got Biden elected is that people went out and vote. So this is the thing. I think this is the key, and I think this is where Workers' Party have to convince people to do, because unfortunately, the anti-Workers' Party sentiment is still very strong. Not as strong as the anti-Bolsonaro sentiment, right? But for those who get into the runoffs, that it's looking like it's going to be Lula and Bolsonaro, people are very much motivated to just vote in blank or not vote. So the challenge here is to get those people who wouldn't vote, to actually vote against Bolsonaro. And the strategy, which goes back to your question, that's I think the big question. So far, I haven't seen anything towards an innovation to promote that sort of engagements online. But it seems like it's a little early just because Brazil has rules and laws that don't allow people to engage in campaigns before a certain time. But I want to be hopeful because we cannot take another 4 years of Bolsonaro. So I want to be hopeful that something's being brewed in the backstage. So once those things had come to the forefront, we're seeing that they're actually taking specific measures to not let that happen again.
David, you're a Brazilian living in the United States. I assume your career path is going to continue here in the United States, but you're very committed and linked to Brazil. I can feel that in the conversation we're having today. What would you give to advice for people in the United States who are concerned about social inequality and the destruction of the environment and want to contribute to the efforts to seek a more just and humane Brazil? What are the role of Americans and academics in this fight in Brazil? Is there a role?
Yes, we're very similar as nations, as countries in the way that our governments are structured. We're very similar. Brazilians love, America. Brazilians really look up to America in the same way that we're very critical of Americans, right? But we are this sort of cousins that we can collaborate. In fact, this is something that I told a lot of my colleagues here in the U.S. is that, Trump is actually turning America, the U.S., in the Latin American country that you guys love to criticize, because inequality in this country has never been so big. Misinformation in this country is going all towards Telegram and WhatsApp now. So in 2024, this is where misinformation is going to be. So looking at Brazil and paying attention to Brazil is actually, and trying to help Brazil, through Brazilian grassroots organizations is a way to avoid the same issues that we're seeing now to actually happen here. And I think this sort of bond can be created to sort of help each other's democracy, because Brazil has always had this history with the U.S. And Brazil is in a position that we can dictate a couple of things, especially given the Amazon, where we're finally becoming more aware of the importance of the environment. So Brazil hopefully will eventually try to develop ways to lead the world in protecting the environment. And this is something that the US can also learn a lot and protect its own environment, for example, and stop the nonsensical fracking that we see every now and then in this country. So I think there's a lot to learn both ways. And I think we need to help each other just because we're still healing from, Brazil is still going through, but in America, we're still healing from this very anti-democratic government, which was Trump. And going back there is not an option to either countries, and we can only help each other. The same way that the US and Brazil helped each other to get into this hole, I think they can help each other to get out and actually prevail together.
So David, I understand you have a robot that seems to be the terror of the right wing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so this is one of the tools that I'm developed here and at Harvard. So this bot on Twitter, it's an account that engages with Bolsonaro supporters and actually engages in a very peaceful manner. It responds to each person with inspirational quotes that he gets from goodreads.com. And it's interesting to see, and this is based on my own research with Bolsonarism, is that about 4 exchanges of messages, these people will always engage in hateful speech or racist speech. You always lead to that sort of speech. And it's not like this bot is baiting them because it's just showing inspirational quotes. It's always like nice and meaningful quotes. But of course, it seems that this is something that they don't like. And with this experiment, I'm trying to understand how many interactions will take for somebody to engage in this sort of speech, and to understand Twitter's terms of service, because according to Twitter's terms of service, hate speech and racism is not allowed, or even death threats are not allowed. But this bot has identified pictures of guns in the conversations with threats, even like disrespectful, offensive content, offensive speech. But so far in this experiment, we found out that homophobic speech is actually what will take down accounts that engage in this sort of content. So I had 4 people calling my bot gay, which was using my account. So they were calling me gay. And then based on reporting everything that sounded offensive, racist, or homophobic, or any sort of hate speech, we try to understand which content will actually lead an account to be taken down. And so far, the very preliminary finding was that homophobic speech is something that Twitter will not tolerate, even over threats with pictures of guns and racist slurs.
And so these accounts have been brought down since you've done this?
Yes. So in that experiment that I let the bot run for 2 hours, and 4 accounts called me gay in a very pejorative way and offensive way. And then by reporting those accounts, they all got suspended.
And how long were they suspended for? Is it 24 hours or is it longer?
So this is the thing. This is something that we're following, because Twitter won't let you for how long. They will actually send you an email and say, we read your report and we suspended this account. So this is something, and this is the problem, because Twitter is not transparent at all. This is why we have to test which violations of the platform that we come across that will actually get people to follow the rules to get suspended. So this is something that we're going to find out too in this experiment. So hopefully, maybe we'll not make a lot of damage, but taking down one homophobe it's already a win. I take it. So if we can take 4, 6, 8, it's all to make this platform a little more, a little healthier. Just because a lot of the political debates in 2012 will happen on Twitter, and we need to preserve our mental health. We're going to be in social anxiety that we've never seen before. So anything that will help tone down things a bit, I think it's worth doing. And it's also, it'll be interesting to see this as an experiment of accountability in terms of service responsibility. So we'll see what comes out of this.
It's a great experiment, very interesting. It could be a kind of an army of lovers, kind of bringing down hate if it were effective. Sounds great. I want to thank you, David, for taking time with us tonight in Brazil Unfiltered, for your joining the efforts of the Washington, Brazil office in promoting democracy in Brazil, and speaking to our audiences about what you know and understand about your country that you love so much. Thank you so much, and até logo.
Thank you, Jim. It was a pleasure. Até logo.
Bye-bye.
Bye.